This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
John, you studied politics and economics at university, not journalism. How did you come to journalism?
I was kind of forced into it, actually. So I began my career actually in the finance industry. Like many people, like many Australians, I left post-uni and went sort of on what I thought would be a soul-searching experience and, like backpacking across Europe. But I actually ended up in London and straight into quite a serious job in finance. Always found, the financial world super interesting and exhilarating, but it was actually always the news aspect to it that intrigued me the most. During that stint in London, I met my now wife, who was American, and she wanted to go back to America. So we left in March 2007. We left London. We quit our jobs. I think we took our last bonuses and went travelling for a few months. And the week we left, Bear Stearns went under. And the week we arrived in the US, Lehman Brothers went under. And if you wanted a job at an investment bank, you weren't going to get a job at an investment bank. So I didn't really have a choice. So from there, I shifted into writing, financial writing, and picked up a few gigs along the way covering markets for a global audience. And from there, came back to Australia and a few years later landed at the AFR and never looked back, really.
The rest is history.
The rest is history,
How do you, it's an interesting background. We've had a lot of people come in here who are lifelong journalists. They've said to me, that's what I always wanted to be. But I haven't asked them this question because I just wonder what your definition of journalism is. Like, how would you explain it to someone? What is journalism to you? Like, what's the purpose of it, I guess?
The essence of journalism to me is reporting the news that does not yet exist, I guess, finding stories that haven't been told yet. It can also be explaining difficult concepts to an audience. But I guess journalism is really about documenting the truth. Like, that's what it is at its core.
That is the main one. And the interesting thing, and I'm going to come back to this, but first of all, you actually are no longer on the tools in the way that you used to be. You're the editor of Capital Brief. For people who haven't worked in media, and even those that do, how is that the job of editor different to the job of a journalist? Like, what's your day-to-day and how different is it? Yeah,
well, the role of an editor at a sort of a big legacy publication and a startup are probably slightly different. Certainly in my current role, I'm even more deeply an editor than I was in the past. But it's really, you have to make decisions. You have to make decisions on whether, part of it is commissioning and setting the daily news agenda, and we want to go and find these stories and here's how we're going to do them. And we've seen this somewhere else. How can we match that story and throw it forward? What are the things our audience is interested in and should be aware of that we should be telling them? Where are our strengths as a publication and what do we want to serve up to the audience? When I was running the business desk at the Herald and the Age, running that section, it was a pretty big section. I had a lot of it was about delegating. There you have a lot of resources to attack stories. You can work with other teams. We did a lot of work together with the politics team and sometimes the state desks as well. So there's a lot of delegating and organising in those places. Also used to work very closely with some of the senior investigative journalists there. But looking back at it now, they're such big organisations, so much more of it there is managerial, whereas when you're in a startup, it's kind of like you're wearing 5 hats. You're doing everything. You're commissioning, you're actually handling the copy, and really helping journalists. We want Capital Brief to be a place where journalists come to do their best work. So I kind of see my role as facilitating that and helping this great team of journos break great stories and write really interesting stories and, get our name out there and bring something different to the table, really. But it's really...
Do you see everything that goes out? Capital Brief, at this, because how many journalists do you have working for you now?
We're around the 20 mark.
Do you
I can't see.
You can't see everything.
We've just got to. In the early days, everything was going through me, and that was pretty intense. Yeah, we're now at the stage where I'm not seeing every single word that goes out the door. We also have 2 overnight newsletters as well, and I am pretty hands off on those now compared to the very start. So
when a journalist comes to you with a story, especially in the early days, how did you determine that this is a Capital Brief story? This is what we're going for. What's the tone and the mission around the business, I guess? Because every editorial job, I imagine, would be quite different depending on the publication's objectives.
Yeah. So we said we wanted to be a publication for decision makers in the new economy. We think that there's been a generational shift in Australian business, and that hadn't been adequately captured or fully captured by the existing media. So we're often telling stories about founder-led businesses in Australia attacking global markets, fast-growing business models, often involving sort of technologies and that kind of thing. And in Canberra, we've tried to bring a point of difference to the table as well, with covering different policy initiatives like the Future Made in Australia Act very deeply. We've also just done the conventional news breaks. Like we had a story on the cabinet reshuffle. We were first on that a couple of weeks ago. But there's a tendency in Australian newspaper journalism to have this kind of really thunderous news approach. If you've ever read a newsletter splash, the front page on a story, it can be very,
like sensational?
Yeah, sensational. I wouldn't say, these are really good journalists doing really good work. It's just a style. When you're selling a story and a piece of print real estate, like you have to have a big, bold headline and really strong, dramatic opening paragraph with lots of adjectives and that kind of thing. And we have tried to not do it that way. We've said that we sort of break stories down and we don't beat them up, and we try to write with a little bit more understated tone and let the stories sell themselves. At least that's the intention. So
I'm interested in this: break stories down, don't beat them up. I like that. Is that sort of like the motto in the newsroom?
It's one of the many things we've kicked around. Yeah. So look, part of it is that we have this, I guess we call it our breaking news items, which we call briefings, which actually do break apart a story. So, often a lot of the news that's out there in a given day in the business world, a lot of it comes from ASX announcements that are publicly available. A lot of it comes from corporate press releases. And publicly available things. And for those items, we actually break them apart into, sort of bullet points. We don't try and weave a sort of 500, 600, 800 word story around it where you can't figure out what the news is. And so that's one of the ways we try to break the news apart. And the other way, as I said earlier, we just try and sort of don't oversell stories when we don't need to, let them sort of, let them carry themselves.
As I understand it, necessary things for Capital Brief to succeed was the ability to break stories. So that's a really core objective of yours, is that need to break stories. And there's this question for me around, as the editor, what pace? So these days with media, the expectation from audiences is that you'll have new stuff all the time and there's constant information. How do you decide what to give space to, what to say to your journalist? Okay, this is a story. We think there's legs here, but I need weeks to commit to this. I need months, sometimes years, sometimes to commit to this in a small media business. How do you make that call? Okay, I can afford this person to go off and do this for that long a time, because they might have this story that's going to mean that we're going to attract an audience we hadn't attracted before.
Yeah, it is. That is one of the hardest challenges, balancing that, need to keep things ticking over, but also allowing people the time to, to do the best work of their careers, hopefully. That's really hard. But, breaking news is really, really hard. And you got to give credit to, we're trying to bring something different to the table. You got to give credit to the publications out there that do break a lot of news. We've actually just tried to focus on areas that aren't being covered and where we have strengths and where we can find things that aren't being written about. And, we've talked about we think there's a generational shift in Australian business, and some of these emerging industries and entrepreneurs behind them. For us, that's kind of the core of our publication. For other publications, it's kind of a thing over off on the side. And so we've been able to report some of those situations and companies rigorously. Probably one of the biggest stories we had was about an executive departure at Canva, one of the biggest startups in Australia, which kind of hasn't faced sort of rigorous scrutiny so far because it's done so incredibly well. But it's a perfect sign of a company maturing and becoming they're headed towards a very big IPO as soon as next year. Really, it already is one of the biggest companies in Australia, but it's always been treated as this thing over off on the side. And there's a perception that Australian business is men in suits and boardroom tables and these companies in Australia that have been around for 100 years, and some of them were spun out of the government and that kind of thing. And we think there's a new generation of business, and those companies deserve to have their stories told as well. And they're becoming powerful companies too, and they deserve kind of scrutiny. And that's what we're trying to bring to the table.
And that's what you mean by the new economy?
Yeah, that's exactly what we mean. So as I said, We think there's a new generation of companies that are really rising to leadership roles across the economy. There's just a generational shift across the economy completely. Like millennials are now in their 40s and in the C-suite, and senior figures in government and billionaires and all that kind of thing, and they're really becoming a really important cohort within the economy. They're also a very big cohort within the economy. We want to tell the story of Australian business through their eyes, through our eyes. I'm in that generation. And there's a whole wave of companies like that too. And the big companies that we all think about, the CBAs, the BHPs, the Qantases, and they're very important, and we report on them all the time. But I think there's a difference in mindset between how they see the world and how the Canberras and the Atlassians.
What is that difference?
Well, in raw political terms, this sort of new generation, this new economy generation, tends to be a bit more progressive. So there's that. They tend to operate in global markets, so they think globally rather than we're a domestic monopoly or oligopoly. We're sheltered by regulation. We need to fight to keep that regulation in a certain way. Media is another example of one of those sort of oligopoly industries where the big players were all founded decades ago, centuries ago in some instances. But this new generation, they tend to be more progressive. They're competing in global markets, so they think differently about that. And there's just a different perspective on their fast-growing companies rather than sort of mature companies. So they're concerned about hiring people, and they're concerned about where do they unlock talent from, and they probably want to, they have a different perspective on policy issues surrounding immigration and those kind of things than some other companies do.
I want to ask you one more question about media, and then I do want to really get into some of the business news stories, particularly that you've touched on already. But this point around trust, so trust in media, trust in journalism has been really low. How are you approaching that at Capital Brief? Is it something you think about a bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I think about that I don't think our industry thinks about enough. I don't think journalists in the trenches think enough about this and how outside the media bubble the levels of trust of media are like alarmingly low. From our point of view, the biggest thing is just transparency around sourcing and where information comes from. So we're very we are very open in citing and linking to other publications when we're referencing their work. And there's a cultural thing in Australia still. It's probably the biggest surprise almost a year into this is that when there's a reluctance in some of the older newsrooms to sort of just say this story was from Capital Brief or the Australian, the legacy companies don't do it to each other. I think it partially reflects the kind of market structure and, publication A wanted to be the only thing that you read, and if someone else had a story, we'll follow it, but we won't reference that they got it from there. We'll say something oblique like media reports suggest or whatever, rather than just saying someone else had it. It's very unique to Australia as well. Having worked in the US, it does not work that way.
Really?
The culture there is very much you cite when you get scooped.
Like credit for credit. Yeah,
and that's something our industry really should adopt. It's good for everyone. It's good for every journalist working in the industry that we have multiple publications thriving.
Do you think that's where the trust was lost?
Look, it's a global phenomenon, so it's not limited to Australia. It's probably worse in other markets than it is here. I think it's partially reflects sort of like the polarisation of society, and people distrust publications that don't reflect their own worldview, and people get in these sort of filter bubbles and that kind of thing. So that definitely seems to be part of it.
I did wonder about that point around tone too, and whether, the way that you're approaching that means that you're able to build greater trust, the even tone might potentially, I wondered that.
Yeah, but with the tone thing, it always struck me as amusing that like one of the more prominent kind of new media properties in Australia in the past decade or whatever is actually a parody of the news, which is, I'm referring to the Batuta Advocate. But you look at the way that their copy is and the way they make fun of like a news report.
Yeah.
And it's just something to think about. Sometimes the tone is from a bygone era.
You're preaching to the converted here. I mean, I think what we do and we try and do is, just tell me like a friend would tell me. Don't tell me like a media report would tell me. That's, I don't know what that means. Can you just actually unpack that in a way that you would tell me at the pub? Let's talk about the new economy. And I'm really interested in the intersection here of politics and business. But first of all, I guess I don't even need to ask you, where do you think growth for this country is coming from? Because I guess you're pretty committed to this new wave of business being where growth is going to come from. Is that how you see Australia? Like, is that the big opportunity for us here?
Certainly think that entrepreneurship is what's going to drive Australia forward. We're historically been driven by minerals exports, increasingly education as well, a bit of financial services, and that will continue for a very long time as
Agriculture,
well.
I guess.
Agriculture
Yeah.
Historically, and but all of those industries are facing these inflection points as well. So the most obvious one for the resources industry and for the energy industries as well is obviously the climate challenges, and that's creating actually huge opportunities in resources extraction in Australia. So there's all sorts of critical minerals that are crucial to the energy transition, and lithium is obviously among them, and copper are the big ones as well. Knowledge economies as well, financial services is by far the biggest employer in Australia as well. It's a somewhat inward-looking industry because banking is domestic, and superannuation is a sort of kind of like domestic massive pool of savings, but increasingly that money's been allocated offshore. But most knowledge sectors in the economy are facing challenges as well. So obviously artificial intelligence is kind of a challenge to all sorts of industries, including media, but it's going to change people's jobs pretty dramatically.
Let me unpick those three, because I actually have separate questions on those three topics. So starting with energy, we have a government very committed to a renewable energy approach. We have an opposition that has really thrown a spanner in the works with a nuclear energy approach. We don't know who's going to get elected at the next election. We don't know who's going to be in power. How has that thrown business, that announcement by Peter Dutton?
Yeah, I think it's look, the energy wars in Australia have been going on for decades now.
True.
All the way back to 3 or 4 governments. Yeah, look, I think business wants certainty, and they keep getting uncertainty. As the sentiment has shifted towards nuclear energy quite significantly, but I think the overwhelming consensus is it's too technically difficult for Australia for reasons that we could go into here that would take
a while.
Take too
Maybe
long.
we can unpack it if Peter Dutton does get elected.
Yeah, well, yeah, and look, it looks like it's going to be a bit of a knife edge, a cliffhanger election, doesn't it? But certainty is lacking, and business always wants certainty.
I mean, the second point you made was this knowledge sector, which I'd never heard it referred to like that. So you're talking about what sort of businesses are you referring to when you talk about that?
Well, white-collar workers, finance is probably the biggest, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff as well.
When we talk about, so the government has a policy, Future Made in Australia. A big part of that is the renewable movement. But a smaller part of that is, keeping our IP here, making sure we're innovating locally. I assume having the brains here rather than sending them overseas to come up with great ideas. Are we primed for that? Is that possible?
I think the government's approach there is very well intentioned, but it usually doesn't come down to entrepreneurs want to have this burning ambition to build things, and policy tweaks can affect that at the margins. But I think it's more down to kind of the raw animal spirits of people wanting to
do new things
and make them work, and they figure out the rest.
There's a conversation about whether Australia is actually like that naturally or not.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. It was culturally unacceptable to do a startup a generation ago, and now it's flipped the other way. There's a tremendous surge in entrepreneurship out there, and it's the success of Atlassian and Canva and a lot of companies overseas as well has really spurred that. And we have great universities that produce great technical talent, and we have strong rule of law, and it's a pretty nice place to live. And we have a lot of things going for us to build an innovation and economy in Australia. And look, the Future Made in Australia initiatives, that seems to be actually about energy and manufacturing, which is a whole other conversation, and there's definitely politics associated with that too.
Yeah.
But look, I do think for a lot of these entrepreneurs, the government's a little bit of a sideshow.
Yeah, interesting. VC was actually what I was going to ask you about next, because my understanding is there was a real rush on here, sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago, and that's dried up quite a bit now. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah. So we've ups and downs of all of these things. We basically had 10 years ago, there was almost no VC in Australia. It just was not a thing. There was still the after effects of the tech wreck around the turn of the millennium. And it took a very long time for it to get going down here as well, and hard work of a few true believers to get things going and a few early success stories. Atlassian was not backed by, there was no VC in Australia.
There was no local investment here, that's right.
But those founders have poured money back into it, so that was part of it. And then, the early few funds, the Blackbirds and the Airtrees, have all made a lot of money on paper. But yes, the cycle did shift when interest rates started rising and people started getting nervous. And before this AI bubble really took off, there was definitely a retreat in VC, and there weren't a lot of deals getting done, and there wasn't a lot of money getting raised. But yes, that market is, experiences ups and downs, like any bigger ups and bigger downs than probably any other market you can think of out there, because it's
emotional, nearly.
Yeah, well, that is a game. That VC game, it's very different to the kind of investing that everyone else that people would become used to. It's, you're searching for home runs, and there's a lot of failures along the way, and then there's one big, huge home run that pays for everything else and then some.
Yeah.
It is a game of hits and misses, and they fully expect to have a lot of misses, which makes it a great thing to cover journalistically. It makes it a lot of fun to cover journalistically, but the people who are actually putting their money into it are very deep-pocketed, and they would be very well diversified outside of their venture exposure. But yeah, it's been one of the big stories in Australian finance over the past few years, is that we actually now have a very vibrant venture capital scene, and that's one of the key things that's powering this whole new economy forward.
And Capital Brief, it would appear.
Well, yeah,
as far as the opportunities that you might have to mark out your key point of difference. Just a couple more questions. The first one, I guess I'm talking to you the day before a rates decision, so this is a sort of an unfair question, but the economy more broadly, what are you seeing? What is Capital Brief seeing around how this all might play out?
The big economic story for the whole year at a very macro level has been Australia and the US being in completely different paths. So up until like a week or two ago, there were fears that we could have a rate hike. That now seems to have dissipated to some extent. The big story, though, has just been persistent inflation. Like, it hasn't gone away. There's been a lot of interest rate hiking over the course of the past 18 months in Australia and elsewhere, and it seems to be more stubborn here than in other markets. There's probably a few technical reasons why that's the case here, and until it goes away, we're probably not going to see interest rates getting any lower, and that's just the reality of it. That's just the way monetary policy works.
How much do you watch what's happening in the US?
A lot. I got to confess, I do watch the US pretty closely. It just has such a big bearing on certainly the sectors that we're interested in. Having spent quite a bit of time there myself, it's always just very interesting to see what's going on over there, and the crazy deterioration of politics in the US is another big story to watch this year that we've been getting into a little bit as well. But yeah, I keep a pretty close eye on.
Will you have someone in the US for the election?
Haven't decided yet.
Okay. That's a budget decision.
I didn't want to commit to it.
That's a budget decision.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of months to go.
So let's see what happens.
Yeah.
I mean, my final question, I think, will just be about you. You've worked in these disruptive media companies. This is the second time around. Is this like, a glutton for punishment, or is it just what you like doing? Why does it matter so much to you that you're working in environments where you are being, disruptive when it comes to media?
Yeah, it's a challenging thing. And, people would say, why would you want to launch a new media business in Australia at this time without an international partner, in this post-social era of news?
Yeah.
I couldn't think of anything more exhilarating and exciting to do. And we just strongly believe that there is a place for what we're doing at Capital Brief, and wouldn't want to be doing anything else.
There you go. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thanks.